Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, amphibian fans of all ages. Welcome to CMNH at Home and our new awesome Saturday series all about scientists at the museum. My name's Lee Gamble. I'm in charge of video conferencing programs at the museum. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite scientists because I love amphibians. It's Roberta Muehlheim. She is the associate, oh wait, see, I told you I was going to mess that up, assistant curator of vertebrate zoology. Hello, Roberta. How are you doing this fine afternoon?
Hi, I'm doing well, thanks.
And you have a lovely bookshelf behind you, so you are also at home. And I'm wondering if someone who studies vertebrate zoology, are you able to do any kind of work at home? What's going on with you these days at home?
Oh, scientists can always find something to do when we're not in the lab because we have papers to publish, grants to write to get funding for our research, and also exploring new topics for our research. So there's plenty to do.
It sounds like all of that scholarly part instead of going out in the field, because I know that your particular role involves lots of different activities. Now, since we're live streaming
Yes.
on Facebook, folks, if you do have questions for Roberta once we get into the meat of the interview, feel free to toss those up there. And our tech guru, Samantha, will be shooting me those images on my phone here so I can ask Roberta your questions. And what I'd like to start out with is just a definition of what vertebrate zoology actually means.
It is the study of everything with a backbone. So that could be mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds. All of those are vertebrates. So in my department, I oversee mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. We have an ornithologist, so he takes care of the bird collection.
Well, that's nice. You got to give Andy something to do, otherwise he'd get up to all sorts of trouble. And you, and I know that you specialize in amphibians. And could you also clarify, in case there's any of our younger viewers who might be wondering, what is an amphibian?
Oh, well, amphibians are an interesting group of animals, and they're typically defined as a group of animals that many of them have what are called biphasic life cycles. And that means that at some point their life is in the water, and then in another part of their life they will live maybe primarily on land. Although depending on the species, that will determine how tightly bound they are to bodies of water. Because as we know, we see frogs spending a lot of time in the water. However, we see them on land as well. But then something like a toad or a salamander may not spend quite as much time in the water as a frog.
Their eggs, though, are gelatinous and squishy, so those eggs must be in the water, correct?
Sure, yes. For many amphibians, even if they do not lay their eggs in the water, they still need to lay their eggs in a very moist environment. Because if you think about a bird egg is protected by that shell. And part of that protection is preventing the contents of that egg from drying out. So amphibians do not have the benefit of a large shell or a hard shell. So they need to lay their eggs in wet environments.
When you and I have spoken in other interviews about the nature of an amphibian, you've also used, and I've forgotten the term now, but it was like a hallmark species, or that amphibians are unique because they can give us insights into the overall health of the habitat of both the water and the land where they live. What was that term?
Oh, they're indicator species.
That was
Is
an
that what you
indicator
were
species,
thinking?
yes. Yes, it was. Thank
Yeah,
you. I just could not remember. Hallmark sounded pretty good, but I was like, nah, no, that's not quite right. So when you're dealing
it's
with
close.
amphibians,
Yeah. I mean,
if they
they're
spend their life
also
in the
referred
water,
to, they're also called canaries in the coal mine because they're generally the first one of the first species that will um, show a response to a contaminant or a disturbance in the environment, particularly in the water. And in large part, that is because they have very thin skin that so things can pass through the skin very easily on an amphibian. So any chemical or disturbance in the water oftentimes can be taken into the body. And so we will see sickness or die off or something of that nature. Um, so,
gotcha. Hence the use of that term indicator species, because they're indicating the
yeah.
overall health of that aquatic environment. And
Mhm.
kids, if you don't know the reference, canary in a coal mine, go look that up later on. Now, when I was a kid, I loved to go out and catch frogs and toads and salamanders, and I knew that I had to keep my hands wet so I didn't harm them and their wet skin when I was handling them. And
Mhm.
that's a big part of your job, is going out in the field, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So as a researcher, um, because as a curator, you wear many hats, if you will. So we, as in the research aspect of our jobs, many of us are out in the field. So I am conducting research on natural populations of amphibians, observing and taking samples and monitoring these populations.
And fortunately for our viewers, we followed you last summer out into some of the museum's natural areas and got some footage of you in action. Let's take a look at that video, and then you and I can discuss more in depth what's going on. Show director Matt, let's run part one of that video, shall we?
Amphibian community here. And to do that, we have to survey all of these areas, all of the ponds and the marsh, and take tissue samples from these animals to determine whether that infection is in fact present. I'm going to go in and dip net, which is typical when you're looking for particularly amphibian larvae. Jackpot. So you dip net and pull it up and just pick through everything, and usually you get at least a couple things. Ranavirus is a large DNA virus that is lethal to amphibians, and not just amphibians. It was first discovered several decades ago in fish, and then we discovered that it had jumped to amphibians, and now most recently we understand that it infects reptiles as well, and it is one of the contributors to global amphibian declines. A good example of what ranavirus can do to an amphibian community is in the story when we went to one of the other museum properties, the Grand River Terraces. One of the ponds there was always known to us as a phenomenal wood frog pond, in that you would hit it in early June and there would be so many wood frog tadpoles, the water would look like it was percolating. And you could stick your hands in and just pull out hundreds of wood frog tadpoles. And about 6 years ago, we went back to witness this again, and it was like a ghost town. There were no amphibians in the pond. It was silent. The goal of natural areas is to preserve these, what we think are these disappearing habitats. So these preserves are very important to researchers and field biologists like me to be able to come back to these protected areas and track changes over time and compare those to areas that aren't protected, and learn more about how we are impacting our planet.
Boy, in case some of our viewers were not aware of it, the museum now protects and stewards over 10,000 acres. And if you didn't catch it, in the very beginning of that video, it said, Ohio's first state nature preserve. How cool is that, that the museum is helping to protect those environments? Now, Roberta, you're talking about this very scary thing called a Rana virus. And that's interesting to me because, hello, right now you and I are both at home because of another kind of virus that has been causing us problems. Oops. And I see Roberta, can you hear me? Because I see you checking your earbuds there. Uh-oh, tech guy Matt, stand by. We're trying to figure out why we've lost sound on Roberta. I'll continue my
hearing,
thought. Hold on, folks. So this is something that
what I'm
amphibians
hearing
don't have to
is
deal with. Matt, tech director Matt is typing at me that he can hear me, I think. But Roberta, are you hearing me as well? Perhaps that means Matt can hear both of us, but we don't hear each other. That's entertaining. And one of the guests has typed, I'm hearing an advertisement.
That was me.
See here, folks. That was you. This is
yeah,
the thrill of live streaming. Oh, but we got you back now?
Yeah.
Yes, score
now I can
for
okay.
Show director Matt. Way to go, man. Hey, it's live, folks. This is what you get. So what I was saying was I was all excited that sign at Mentor Marsh said Ohio's first state nature preserve. And that is just so cool that the museum is involved with protecting all these natural areas. But then in the midst of seeing all this wondrous beauty of nature, then you're talking about this terribly scary Rana virus. And right now, we humans are dealing with this new novel coronavirus. There's many different types of viruses out there. Could you give us a little bit more detail as to what does ranavirus actually do to an amphibian?
Yeah, well, it is this very unfortunate series of symptoms. Basically, it shuts down organ function, but it is expressed in different ways depending, one, on the group of animals that catches it. It'll be different in amphibians than what we see in reptiles. And so often what we find in amphibians is you'll see hemorrhaging around the mouth, or in the back legs, or around the vent, or even in the tail. And as their organs shut down, they get sicker, of course, and they become lethargic. They don't respond to cues that a predator is approaching. And then they can die quite rapidly. It depends on the species. It depends on the dose of virus that they have contracted. Also, it's important too that certain life stages also develop different disease symptoms, because we have seen adult amphibians that have symptoms showing necrosis or the breakdown of the tissue in the hands and feet. So flesh will pull away from the bone, they'll get sores, things of that nature. We don't see that as often as what we see in the larvae, but that may also be because as adults they're quite solitary and they live deep in these holes, like old mammal burrows. And so they're harder to find once the adults leave the pond after a breeding season. They're a little more difficult to find. So it might be happening perhaps more than we think, just because we aren't observing it, just because they're difficult to find.
My gosh, what you've just described.
Yeah.
It sounds
Go ahead.
so similar to some of the. No, it's okay. The delay is always crazy, folks. We're hearing all of these descriptions of social distancing for us as humans, and then you're talking about all these little larvae and these little amphibian babies that are all close to each other, easier to spread the virus, right? And then the adults are socially
Yeah.
distanced. That's kind of amazing that we can
Yeah.
learn how a virus functions from other species. But I want to toss out another word too, because zoonotic is, I think, a word that a lot of the public is now becoming aware of. Could you describe what that means? What is it when a virus is zoonotic?
Well, it's going to be passed among these animals. So when I what I referenced in the video was that we think this virus first began thousands of years ago, perhaps in fish, and that this virus then jumped from fish into amphibians. And so those species of amphibians that lived in those waterways, those amphibians that tend to like bodies of water that support fish, were probably the first ones to get it. So we find that they show some resistance to that virus because they've had a chance over to evolve some resistance. And then we have more what we call naive species in the woodland pools where there are no fish that are just, it's early for them in a sense, evolutionarily for them to encounter this virus. So they are much more sensitive. And then the fact that it has gone into reptiles now, we're finding that some reptiles are getting it. Some box turtles have been found to have it. So, so when you get a virus that's bouncing around between groups of animals, yeah, that becomes a concern too. If a virus can rapidly evolve to live in very different groups of animals.
It's not just the virus, though, that adapts. You had been telling me in an earlier talk we had about some of the interesting ways that the amphibian larvae also adapt to their changing populations. Can you speak about that a little bit? You were describing to me the different sizes of the amphibian larva.
Oh, well, that's a little different. So we find sometimes in groups of animals where, well, let me back this up and just tell the specific story, I guess, of this study. We found that in a very small number of ponds that we had been conducting work in, that the population of salamanders that were using that pond within their larval community, that in one species of salamander, there were two different looking groups of animals, if you will. We call them morphs. So you have the normal looking larvae, the type of larvae, how we're used to larvae looking for that species. And then within that exact same population, it was the same species, yet these larvae looked different in that they have very large heads, their mouths are wide, and then they tend to grow very rapidly and they get big, like twice as large as the normal larvae in that pond. And so this was curious. And so currently I'm studying this, and what I believe is happening is that these are showing what we call a resource polymorphism. And this is not uncommon in other animals, but what this is that environmental stimuli or environmental triggers are causing certain individuals in a population to change in their body form in response to that stimuli. So what is in this specific situation, what I believe is happening is when you get overcrowding because of all of these larvae in the pond, and these woodland ponds, the water evaporates over time, and that causes crowding. And it also means there's a lot of competition for resources in that pond. So everybody's eating the same thing, and as your habitat is getting smaller, you're all competing for the same things. So that's the stimuli then for some of these larvae to then, I guess, produce this trait that enables them to get at the richest resource in the pond. So they become cannibal morphs. So they begin eating the other salamander larvae. And this is actually very beneficial in that here's all of these other salamander larvae, and that's a very nutritious food item for them. It's easy to incorporate into your body because you're basically eating the same tissues. So your body can break that tissue down and use it more readily. So they grow faster and they grow bigger. And yeah, and that's why they have these giant heads and a wider mouth so that they can accommodate a bigger food item, and more muscle in their head to be able to eat eat their cohorts.
Whoa, man. In response to
And it
environmental
also
pressures.
helps them get out of the pond.
Oh, right, because they can
Sorry.
metamorph into the
Yeah.
adult form.
Yeah.
Wow. Man, that is pretty crazy, folks. I'm gonna shorten that down into one sentence. They get bigger so they can eat their siblings. Ah, that's amazing. Amphibians are cool and weird and awesome. Well,
Yeah,
once you've
amazing.
gone out and collected, once you've collected these specimens, you can't do all your research on them outstanding in a pond, right? So you bring them back to the museum, and that's the second video that our show director Matt's going to run here, is showing where you do your hands-on research with those specimens. So if it's all right with you, Roberta, we're going to jump to part 2 of our video.
Sure.
These are research collections. And where we're going right now is what we call our wet collection. So you'll see many, many, many jars. And in these jars are, of course, animals. These are amphibians, and we have reptiles, and we have fish. And in these jars is ethyl alcohol, and that it is preserving these animals, these biological specimens. So you may wonder why we have so many, and what is the importance of a collection like this. The importance of natural history collections. There are many, many important functions that they serve. They inform us about biodiversity on the planet, about genetics, about changes in the environment like climate change. The list is endless, the types of information that we can gather from biological collections. Now, you may wonder why we have so many specimens. And I guess one way to look at it is a library is also a collection, but it is a collection of books. This is no different. Each one of these animals is cataloged like a book, and each one of these specimens has information and stories to tell, much like a book. Where it differs, however, is that instead of each specimen representing one book, it represents volumes and volumes and volumes of books, because it contains so much information and so many stories, each one of these specimens. And the other thing about it is some of these volumes are in a language we have yet to decipher. So as technology advances and improves, it provides us the tools for us to decipher that language. so that we can learn more. So when you look at a collection like this, what you're seeing is potential information. That it's just vast and exciting what we can learn.
A language that we haven't translated yet. Are you referring to just DNA technology, or
I'm referring to everything.
All the chemistry of an animal's
Yes,
body? Wow.
anything. Yeah, and it's quite amazing. And because these, as many scientists will tell you, these represent, they answer questions that we have about the past, questions we have about the present, but it also provides answers to questions we have yet to even ask. So that, if that gives you any idea of the importance of these collections.
The ending of that video is just my hand going, look at all the things. It's amazing. You do such a great job of explaining why a museum needs that many specimens, and that phrase that your collection is like a library of species. Oh, that's just such a beautiful phrase. I like it so much. But that's not what kids think of when they think of a museum. Like when I was a kid, I thought of dinosaur skeletons and the taxidermed specimens. And what I'd like to ask you is, just for a little bit of your insight, the different things you can learn from those kind of specimens where they're taxidermed and posed in some kind of lifelike position compared to what you collect in what we just saw.
Right. First, I'd like to say I do own more than one shirt. Yeah, taxidermy, as you said, is prepared for the purposes of display, and like you said, in lifelike poses. Whereas a research specimen is prepared for the purpose of scientific study. So they're preserved in ways that will help a scientist get at and collect the information they need to answer specific questions. So we may have skeletal remains, or we may have what we refer to as a wet specimen, which is what you saw in the video. And those are whole-bodied specimens that are preserved in ethyl alcohol. And then we also have the fur and the skins of animals as well. So these allow, because we have scientists from around the world that visit these collections for their research. And so there's a variety. It depends on what the question is.
Man, that's a great, I appreciate you explaining that, because it is definitely one of the hidden treasures of any museum. Is there, well, if they're a research museum like ours, where it's a collection of specimens that are teaching us more and more about those creatures. Now, I'm pretty sure there's folks watching today that are going to get inspired by this and think, man, I'm doing all this iNaturalist stuff and I'm rocking out my BioCube, and I want to go out there to a museum natural area and catch some frogs or catch some salamanders. And I would like you to explain what is you, since this is your field of expertise, what would you say is the best way for our amphibian lovers out there to experience amphibians out in natural areas?
Well, they are, of course, in my opinion, amazing animals. And I love when people are interested in them, because quite often I think amphibians are overlooked as being boring, but they're not. They're anything but. So I, of course, encourage people to learn more about them. With that said, however, we have to be careful how we interact with these animals, because they do get diseases like the ranavirus that I just mentioned, or chytrid fungus. We can transmit or carry these diseases between wetlands if we're not careful. So we have to practice our own social distancing, if you will, to protect amphibians. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go out and observe them and try to learn more about them, but to do so carefully. So if you go to a pond, I recommend first, if you go to a pond where you suspect that amphibians are living, where there might be larvae or tadpoles, walk around the perimeter and look, and then also stop and just watch the water for a while. Because as you walk around the edge, salamander larvae and frog tadpoles will often swim away from the edge because they're aware that predators on land will come up and try and catch them. So they will go out into deeper water. They'll swim into areas like leaves and stuff to hide. So once you walk around and look to see if you see anything swimming away, then pick a spot and just stay and sit for a minute. And then soon they'll start to come out again. And you may see them swimming around, going back to eating or whatnot, and watch them that way. And then also, as you walk around a pond, look if there are branches in the water. You may see egg masses that are attached. If you do get in the pond, be very careful, because if these egg masses are knocked off where they have been attached, they can fall to the bottom where the water is cooler and they may not hatch. And so we have to be very careful when we're in the water to not do that. So another thing is, if you go in the water and you are moving around and you are trying to capture some of these tadpoles, one, you have to make sure your hands are clean. If you have lotions or even a residue from hand sanitizer and then you touch the animals, they can absorb that and get sick. So I would recommend, if you do catch them, have a clear jar that you fill with water and put them in there, and then you can look at them that way. But always put them back when you're done. Don't take them home. Don't release them in another pond, because you could be introducing disease. Don't take them home and put them in your pond, because again, you could be introducing disease. And when you're done in that pond, when you get out, like all field workers do, we have to bleach all of our equipment, our boots, everything before we even go to another place. We have to make sure that they're bleached. All of that has dried. There's no mud in our shoes. It's quite a process. And we need to do this, though, to protect these animals. And if you care about them and you're interested in them, then you should take the appropriate measures to protect them.
I'm glad you mentioned us humans traveling from one habitat to the other, because that's how I wanted to finish up our interview, is showing our viewers a behavior of some amphibians that I did not know even happened. And until I started working at the museum, I'll admit that I was a little embarrassed of myself. But I didn't know that some of them travel during breeding season. And show director Matt has a couple of pictures to illustrate this idea. What are we looking at here, Roberta? What's that map?
Well, those that looks like salamanders, but frogs do this as well. But so every year, and maybe not every year, let me back this up by saying a lot of amphibians, particularly salamanders, have to wait until they're mature enough to mate. So that's usually around 2 years of age for many of them. And they often go back to breed in the pond that they were born in. So there is this fidelity, if you will, to their natal pond, the pond they were born in. And so they will travel from their terrestrial homes, these old mammal burrows or wherever it is that they're living, when they get the right environmental cues. And they like to move when it's kind of wet and it's cool, and they travel at night, and they migrate to these ponds, these breeding pools where everybody meets up. And usually the males will arrive in advance of females, a little earlier, and wait. And then when the females show up, then they have these big breeding events. And what you're seeing from this photo here, or this illustration rather, is that sometimes humans build things that are in the path of these migration routes, and sometimes they're roads. And these animals can get run over by cars. And so often, as you see in the Cuyahoga Valley, they'll put up signs. See, there you go. That's a spotted salamander. That's a native species. You may find their eggs and their larvae now, or their eggs at least. So yeah, so they put up signs for you to be careful. Sometimes they even close the roads down. And frogs do the same thing. So this doesn't just protect salamanders, but it will protect frogs as well.
When you were describing the process of them all arriving at the breeding pond, I was thinking to myself, well, that doesn't sound any different than a pre-quarantine situation at some dance club. All the guys are hanging out like, think any girls are going to show up? And then all the girls show up. They're like, hey, party time. And that's
It's
delightful
like
that museums. Right. That's wonderful that museums like ours are helping to make the public aware of that. And even that there are signs like that say, watch out, there might be a salamander walking across the road. Roberta, do you have a favorite amphibian?
Oh, I have to say that's such a hard question for me. And not just for amphibians, but all animals. Everything is my favorite for one reason or another. So I can't say that I do have one.
That's a safe answer. That way you don't annoy any of the amphibians.
I don't want anyone to feel bad. It's like my mother telling us she loved us all the same.
Well, I've enjoyed talking about amphibians. The weather's getting nicer now, and so many of us are so ready to get out of our homes and get outside. It is now too early. Are there amphibians out there now that we could go and observe?
Oh yeah, there are a few species, or several species, that have already migrated to ponds and laid their eggs, and there's probably tadpoles and salamander larvae present in many ponds right now. There are some species that will breed a little later in the season, which is probably going to start soon. So you may be hearing toads right now that are calling. So yeah, there's a lot to be seen. And I would like to say as well that we often believe that all of the cool stuff is in another country or another continent. And I will remind people that we have some amazing amphibians in our state, and amazing diversity. So don't think that you have to go somewhere exotic to see the really interesting animals, because we have them right here in our own backyards. So there, from the little redback salamander that you'll find in the forests, to these some of these larger ambystoma salamanders, like the spotted salamander that you saw, to some amazing and beautiful frogs too. I mean, our native wood frog and our gray tree frogs, for example, these are frogs that are able to freeze in the winter and not and be able to thaw without damaging their tissue. that is just fascinating. If humans can learn how to do that, this could totally change organ donation, because currently we can't freeze organs without damaging them. But if we know how frogs are able to do this, some of these species, this could open up organ transplant for us.
That's amazing. From
So-
learning about viruses to like cryogenics, man, amphibians can teach us so much. It has been so
And
fun talking with you.
regeneration.
Yeah, and regeneration. I want to get out there and look at some amphibians now this afternoon because it's nice outside. And I've kept you long enough. Roberta Muehlheim, thank you so much for letting us hang out and pester you this afternoon. We really appreciate your time. Folks, for watching, thank you for hanging out with us with CMNH at Home. And I'd like to give you a virtual high five. Here you go, a distant high five, Roberta. Yay! Talking about amphibians today, folks. Thanks so much. We'll see you maybe next Saturday for another Scientist Saturdays. And for now, farewell and happy amphibian viewing.
Thank you.